Um, Good evening, everyone. I welcome you to this installment of Table Talk, a series of conversations with academics and writers who we admire who write on animals. We're the Indian Animal Studies Collective. I'm Susan Haris, and my co-host Anu Pande is also here. The Indian Animal Studies Collective broadly aims to bring together academics and writers who are working on animals in India and South Asia. Today we have with us Ozan Zeybek from Free University Berlin. We are going to be talking to him on his essay, Security, Dispossession, and Industrial Meat Production in Turkey. Thanks, Ozan, for accepting our invitation.
Thanks for inviting me.
I thought we could begin this conversation by talking about how you got to writing this piece, because it looked like, when I read the essay, it looked like this was not a broadly accepted view. This was not seen by a lot of people, the suffering of the animals, or even a lot of people don't seem to have noticed this large-scale shift as having taken place. So how did you get to noticing this change? Was it very evident to you?
No, it wasn't. Actually, it started with a radio program that I listened to. I was in the car. I remember that moment. And one of the southeastern part of Turkey, there is a city called Siirt. It is the Kurdish majority region. And for clarification, Turkish and Kurdish, they are very similar. I'm talking to a different context, so I'm explaining that. Turkish is the majority population in Turkey, and Kurdish with K is the minority population. Anyway, this town was a Kurdish majority region, and the candidate of the mayor was talking about building a huge barn at the outskirts of the city. A barn, I thought to myself, like, why would you do that in the first place? We are talking about modernization, development, and all that stuff. And it was about 12, 13 years ago or so. And then I looked into it. How come a town imagine itself to become a barn city, a cattle city, to put all the animals inside? Then I realized there is something going on. There is an animal population. I'm not just talking about dogs and cats, which is ordinary street animals in Turkey, but cattle, chicken, lamb, goat, all these different type of animals, which are useful to human beings. So they had to redesign the whole city. So I looked into that story and found a lot of violence, really, what happened to humans and animals, and how we can talk about really the Kurdish issue from a different perspective. From then on, I started visiting the region and the villages, and talk to villagers as well, to human beings, and let them tell their stories, not just their stories as human beings, but my second question, my follow-up question was, what happened to your animals? So there I stumbled upon a story that was important to me, and I guess important to the Turkish population. I will expand on that with the questions, I guess, but that is the introduction. Is it better for me to speak shorter so that you can ask more questions, or?
No, it's really up to you. You can answer as you see fit. But
I could expand, but I prefer shorter answers so that you can jump in.
Okay, all right, that works. I wanted to hear more about this redesigning. And you talk more about growth and profitability. So did this redesign escape critical attention because it was advertised as good for the society? Were there no protests from people who cared for animals?
Yeah. First, they couldn't redesign the city because it requires a lot of money and infrastructure and architectural intelligence and all that stuff. These are poor cities. They were the plan, they were the plans, and the execution was missing, obviously. So the cities, all these cities remained as they are. And can I show a short picture from that period? I can't share it with you. Somehow you have to allow me to do so.
Okay, I'm going to try to do that.
In the meantime, they couldn't execute it. I'm just keep talking. They couldn't execute that, and the rebellion came from the Kurdish population, not because of their animals. That's part of the reason, but there had been an ongoing conflict between the Turkish majority army, the state, and the Kurdish minorities, and they were demanding their rights and human rights violations and all that stuff. So I tried to put a different angle to that story. It's not just about human rights violations that we are talking about, because entire networks of life had been destroyed during that period. So it was not just a violence against humans, but it was violence against trees, farms, animals, all sorts of animals. And it was about destroying the whole landscape in order to get rid of the conflict, so to say. And it was done mostly by the Turkish state. So I can show the picture right now, I guess. Give it just, here we see that town that I just mentioned, the barn town, so to say, that which wasn't, which they were not able to build. So that was a scene from early millennium, that the cattle roaming around human beings, goats are just with humans, because they had to get their animals from villages and take them with human beings, took them to city centers, town centers. There were no solutions because the army forced them to just, how to say, the army displaced them in a very short period of time. In 1 week, they said, if we come in 1 week back, we don't want to see you here. Either you join us to the Turkish military or you just leave this village. So all these people, the Kurdish minority people, took their animals. Some of them sold their animals to, very cheaply. And some of them took their animals and brought them to city centers. And that's a scene from that period of time. And 1990s, early 2000s.
I wanted to hear, and this was one of the things I think that's been coming up in our previous conversations as well. There's this, because you talked about ecological networks, and it's evident that these people who've been pushed to the outskirts of these cities, they had to flee with their animals. But at some point, you also mentioned that these people would also have sold these, or would have used these cattle for meat. So what kind of ecological networks are we talking about? Is it a different mode of life? Is it a more local, more close-knit way of life, as opposed to capital production, where humans and animals are both just objects?
This is the shift that I'm investigating in the article, by the way, the shift from, so to say, free-range husbandry to industrial husbandry. And let me say it in upfront. I'm not romanticizing the old ways of doing that. There is this structures of patriarchy. It's not a nomadic life. It's not necessarily the best form of life. It's not exempt of violence and all that stuff. Regardless, I'm looking into this shift and what happened and who lost in this battle, so to say. The free-range version, where it was executed or carried out by the Kurdish villagers, were, as the name mentions, it was free range. The animals were indigenous, and by indigenous, I'm not talking about 2 generations. I'm just talking about 2 generations. I'm not talking about these ancient animals coming from ancient times. No, we are talking about 2 generations, animals who are adapted to the climate, to the region, to the grasslands, and all that stuff. It was these people and their animals were displaced, and then the switch took place to industrial production, where the producers were not villagers anymore, but entrepreneurs. Because in order to execute or carry out all these process, the industrial production, you need to have connections in the capital city, in Ankara. You have to know how to get funding. You have to know how to apply for EU funds, European Union funds, and all that stuff. So it requires a different sorts of cultural / social capital. The villagers couldn't do that, and they didn't have also the kind of financial capital to start with this kind of enterprise. So I'm looking at this shift. What happened to animal species? What happened to humans? What type of production units have come into being? So this is the shift that I'm looking into it. And I also see a kind of loss in that. Again, not to romanticize it, but a kind of loss, because we are talking about climate crisis, we are talking about drought. Turkey is becoming more and more dry. We don't have enough water, and in the upcoming years, it will get worse. All the indicators show that. And we need to find resilient ways of doing husbandry and also agriculture. And one of the ways of doing that is to use animals or do agricultural stuff which are already adapted to that environment. In this new system, in the new setup, in the industrial setup, everything is connected to the kind of larger production chains. Feed, come from somewhere else. Antibiotics come from somewhere else. Hormones come from somewhere else. Animals come from somewhere else. Finance comes from somewhere else. The whole setup, the design, the architecture come from somewhere else. And farmers becoming dependent on all these factors, banks, investors, MPs, politicians, and all that stuff. So my question would be here then, how could we really imagine this more resilient system where it also enables villagers some sort of autonomy? That would be my question. And the type of animals that is used in this setup is highly important. You can't just have one without the other. The animals matter in that regard. How they function, how they are connected to human beings, how they are connected to other factors in that production unit, in grasslands, climate, and all that stuff.
Go ahead, Anu.
Thanks, Susan. So Ozan, while reading your article, I was really struck by how many similarities or parallels I could find between what you describe of Turkey in the last, since the beginning of the decade, and the developments in India to some extent. Because here too, small farmers find themselves at a disadvantage. The use of genetically modified seeds and the fertilizers that are then required make farming less profitable and more untenable for small farms, just as you've spoken about in the case of Turkey. And we see in India the same kind of preference for high yielding cows and biochemical interventions to make them high yielding, as opposed to breeds of cows which are better suited, more indigenous breeds, so to speak. And the result of this in the case of India has been that a lot of small farmers have ended up with massive debts. In some cases, the debts are not even that massive, but they can't repay them because agriculture has become for them completely untenable. They don't make anything out of it anymore. They can't repay these debts, and there has been a big spate of suicides, farmer suicides. That's become like a huge problem in India. I don't really have figures to quote for this at this point of time, but it's very likely, looking at the massive waves of migration from villages to urban centers in India, that large numbers of farmers have also had to give up farming in India, just as you speak about in the case of Turkey. Going on from that, you've explored two mechanisms that have been employed for a biopolitical control of animal bodies in Turkey. The first one being military conflict and the second one being anti-market policies. I wanted to request you to maybe elaborate a little on the anti-market policies and how or whether you see them configuring in the larger project of state building or redefining the state as it has happened in Turkey. And I ask this question because at present we've got something similar but also different going on in India, which revolves around the question of the consumption of beef and the slaughter of the cow, which is considered a holy animal by the Hindus, and the lynchings that have happened in the last few years of people who are employed in slaughtering cows and selling their meat. And that's obviously a part of this whole redefining of India as a Hindu state or nation. So I wonder how that plays out in Turkey.
Yeah, and there are so many components that you asked. First, the depth, the similarities between different regions. We really need to expand on that because we come across similarities, not just between India and Turkey, but in Lebanon, in South American countries, in so many different places. So what are the structures that we really need to somehow align together? That's one question that I'm raising. And very similar thing, before focusing on your question, the core of your question, one of the things that I find in Turkey, I'm visiting different villages and regions, and people are moving out of villages. The young generations do not want to stay there. I guess this is also a problem in India as well, that somehow urban centers are swelling in numbers and villagers becoming less in numbers. Youngest villager that I just visited the village, and the youngest villager in that particular village was over 50 years old. And I am the last generation, he said. I am the last generation who can do all this stuff. And no one knows after me that how to take care of this animal, how to take care of the soil and all that stuff. This is a problem, I guess, again, because we are really going through, or we are seeing the startings or beginnings of a crisis. And I really urge us to take this crisis very seriously. I'm talking about the climate crisis, how to become more resilient. We can't really pile up 50 million people on urban centers, on apartment blocks, and then expect everything will go away somehow. We really need to think of distributing the populations in meaningful ways and to become more locally autonomous, create autonomous units, so to say. That's my subjective position. Your question, what I try to do is to think about the concept of free markets. We are somehow, that's my, again, subjective position here, that we are deceived by this very, so-called positive connotation of the phrase, free markets, as if they are free. My claim, they are not free at all. We are talking about monopolistic capitalist powers here. They are far from free. Actually, states intervene, corporations intervene, powerful parties, MPs, politicians, and all these, powerful groups really bend and twist all these structures, and all the time. They are far from free. And I try to show two sides of the same story. Capitalism, the way we know it, uses two different forms of power. One is about the kind of soft power that as I describe it, the subsidies, the financial tools, the convincing people and all that stuff. And the other one, and which is a required part of any transformation and capitalist transformation, is violence. So how come we come across that violence at some point when all these soft powers fail or are not enough? We see that kind of violence come into the picture. So I try to tell the two sides of the story at the same time, how a transformation takes place by soft power as well as by violence when it comes to it. So, and try to define the concept of the notion of free markets and what we are going through. And sorry, and last bit of your question, really, that was important. That's definitely part of the state building. States are not just built and stay there forever. They have to perform that kind of statehood all the time by creating and rearranging the setup with the incoming new waves. So we are seeing state building over and over again, the Turkish state as against the minorities in Turkey, then as against Kurdish people, again, as against what not. So states are being built all the time. That would be my intervention.
I was thinking about what you were talking about earlier, and I'm wondering if there's if there's a third position to be had, or if we have to work with what we have, which is to say, on one hand, it seems like these farmers or these poorer people who are pushed to the outskirts because they are oppressed and because they're subjugated by capitalist production as well as the military. It seems like as academics and scholars, we are in a position to defend them. We have to defend them and speak up for them. And at the same time, there is this impulse to also say that we cannot romanticize their relation to cattle as well. So how do we navigate this position? On one hand, they are oppressed by the military and the capital, which makes them the minority position that needs advocates. But at the same time, their relationship with animals is not it's not pure or innocent, as Haraway may call it. So then, what kind of positions do you think is available for people who want to think critically about human-animal relations?
It's a tough question again. What I do is to turn the table and talk about the powerful parties in all these stories, like how actually the urbanite middle-class people romanticize all these people, or see them as ignorant, backward people arriving to cities and creating problems. So I try to dismantle all these perceptions and also show that the middle-class lifestyle is not necessarily the best way. You can't really teach that to everyone and expect the world to become a better place. So I try to undermine all these powerful perceptions. Can I show you another picture? All these Kurdish people, not necessarily Kurdish, but all these villagers coming from different parts of Turkey were received as ignorant and backward, and they were so many movies about them as ignorant people with their animals and all that stuff. Just one example is this. You see that, right? This is one of the numerous examples that we identify these villagers. This is the classical, so to say, village dress that a Turkish audience will directly identify it. And then you see the animal very close and very ignorant, very backwardness, all these narratives. How can we push them back and create this kind of, or undermine the self-confidence of middle classes or urban people? This would be my way out. I can't really say I can speak up for all these people. I can't say, oh, the old life was so great, let's go back there and etc. But what I can do is to just reflect on my own middle class position, where I stand, and challenge the power structures there. So in order to have this kind of cheap, accessible food coming into the cities and etc., many people have to pay a lot of, that they are incurring debts on other people's shoulders. If I can show that, that's a good step forward for me.
So then, do you think that the suspicion that people have towards these people, the Kurdish people, as having violent relationships with animals, would a suspicion like that from, say, a critical animal studies scholar, would you say that that's misguided?
The perception of coming from the critical animal studies that these people exercising lots of violence towards their animals, it is in a way violent, but there is a scale. I was watching this documentary about this nomadic tribe in Iran and in Turkey. They were crossing the border. And at one point, they were so idyllic, romanticized the animals. They love their animals. They are living with their animals. They know how to look after them, take care of them, and all that stuff. At one point, one of the women from the documentary, from that tribe, started beating the horse because the horse wasn't delivering or carrying the things and etc. And the beating took place like 10 seconds or so. In the movie, it is a long time. And the middle class audience in Istanbul took discomfort with this. Oh, this is bizarre. Why would they do that? And etc. I thought about that moment a lot, really. I mean, somehow we love the animals. We have, some of us have dogs and cats and etc. And we project on these other people also this kind of violence, or a very similar picture. Actually, it's upside down, but coming from the same road, we romanticize them. They're just living in this very, green pastoral scenes and all that stuff. So again, what I could do there is to think about the violence we create in this type of society, not that woman beating their horse, that individual violence, but the kind of slaughterhouses that we created, the shelters we put our dogs into, and the meat the amount of feed, the volume of meat, these societies that we created today in big metropolitan centers, what type of violence does it require? So before talking about what other people do to their animals, I really need to take the ball back and bring it to my home, I would say. It doesn't deny that there is no violence, but there is violence. There is violence there, obviously. But again, where do we start to tell the story?
Thanks for
Does
that.
that make sense? I don't know, but
Yeah,
it
yeah.
is.
Yeah, I think
It is not about an academic position, by the way. It's a political position. Then I'm making a political claim in that regard.
What I found really interesting about your essay is also that it seems to tap into, reality not only as perceived by the middle class or the dominant view, but it also seems to bring into focus how reality is for the animals who are suffering or for the Kurdish people who are suffering. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, because it seems like there's always discussion about what really is happening, what actually is going on. And there's, in the beginning of your essay, you talk about how this famous academic talks about agriculture or farming, and then you say that, well, that's not actually what's happening. So, is it two versions of reality? Is it two different interpretations? Or is it that the dominant interpretation completely discounts what's happening outside of their control?
But could you rephrase your question again so that I can understand it better? I understood it, but sorry for me one more time.
Okay, I realize that it sounds really abstract, but what I'm trying to say is, it seems to me that the dominant position adopted by economists or famous scientists who talk about efficiency and so on, all the it is very possible that what's happening to these farmers who are in debt, or these farmers with the indigenous breeds, I mean, it may be possible that this data is available to them, or that they can see what is happening, but I want to try to understand why it's not registered as a problem as it is registered in the essay for you. So I'm wondering if it is not registered as a problem because it is a different interpretation of the issue at stake, or if it is because they can't see the reality of what's going on the other side.
They see a reality, I would say, and it is also very important what they see, because we really need to be able to understand that very well so that we can criticize it at the same time. They have this unique measurement, GDP, gross domestic product, and each year they try to increase the volume of everything. Not, they are not selective in that regard. Even medical bills are good for the GDP. If we get more sick for cancer, for if animals use more hormones, that's good for the economy. They increase the economy, so to say. Gross domestic product, I don't need to explain that, I assume. So this is a bizarre way of seeing the world, in a way. It works at so many levels. It measures the countries, it ranks the countries, which we really need to criticize, by the way, but it works for the economic mind, for the states, for the politicians and all that stuff. So if it is very difficult to juxtapose my side of the story, the way I tell the stories, and their way of seeing things, because my version will probably decrease the GDP in the long run, because I'm talking about degrowth, I'm talking about resilience structures, I'm talking about less industry and all that stuff. I'm not against industry per se, by the way, again, to substantiate my position. It is very select. It depends on the context, what we are talking about and what really is at stake. We really need to look at it case by case. But for the economist mind, it is either growth or go to hell. So that division really creates a split. It is very difficult to speak to an economic-minded economist, so to say. Not all economists are like that, but when they are just, adopt this kind of attitude, it is very difficult to then converse with them, honestly speaking. So again, though, our version, the anthropological geographical version, is a reality. I mean, we are also limited in our capacity to see how we are connected to each other, how we can come up with different solutions, how we can really engage with animals in different ways. So it is not theirs is false and ours is the correct one. I wouldn't go that far. That's my answer, I guess. But it is priorities and it's about power, definitely.
And I wanted to ask you if we can think maybe collectively about what kind of values you would attribute to these farmers with the indigenous breeds and so on, because you talk about the normative claims of profit and growth that the capitalist production and military that they both push for. So as an alternative to that, I guess we could say that we have local ways of living, local ways of ecological networks. But if we are to push that, uh, are there more values or attributes that we could give to these communities based on maybe your ethnographic work?
I guess there is. I mean, let me tell you an anecdote. I was in a village and the cattle was out there on the grasslands and they were just taking care of themselves, the cattle. Two officials from the state, from the local state administration, arrived in the village and just, oh, we have huge news for you. This is good news. It's if you are young, then you will get some subsidies. If you are women, then you will get 5% more, and etc. So what do you expect us to do? The villagers asked. And the official said, well, take those cattle off the grasslands and put them in a barn. That's what we want. So a closed space and put them and etc. And why would you do that? Why would we do that? Because there are subsidies coming from the European Union. But that's not an explanation. See, right? I mean, the money is there, obviously, but what is the purpose for doing so? Because in this setup, the animals find their own feed. They can mate by themselves, copulate by themselves. They just distribute the excrements by themselves so it can fertilize the soil better. So things are cheaper, less carbon, less energy, less money, and all that stuff. What you want is to put them into a closed space because there is funding coming from the European Union. And what is the outcome of that? So see, there is this kind of benefits actually just thinking or embracing not the old ways, but the more autonomous ways, I would say. I would call it this way, by the way. And it doesn't say that everything was right about that village or everything was right about the relation between animals and humans in that village, but things should be reassessed, I would say. And what is going to happen with the shit that they just excrements of the animals? Oh, then you need to call the administration. There will be a truck coming into the village and they will pump out all that and load it somewhere else, load it on, into a river, into a river. This even doesn't make sense. So what we try to do is actually with the colleagues of mine here in Germany and also in Turkey, come up with solutions that require less financial capital, first of all, and less energy, especially less carbon emissions. So how can we come up with solutions that require less of these both? Because one is important for the autonomy of the farmer, and the second one is very vital for the climate crisis that we are going through. Sorry for the sun is coming from a very strange angle. I see myself coming from dark to light and the other way around. I can change my location, but anyway, let's stick with this for a moment.
Anu, go ahead.
Thanks, Susan. There's no problem with the sun, Ozan. Please just go on the way you are. I wanted to take up the notions of efficiency and self-sufficiency that you mentioned in your article. And I find them very reminiscent of colonial enterprises in the past and the politics of colonization, because it seemed to work kind of exactly in the same way. do you also see a certain continuity in the way these categories are used still as justification for acts of violence, be it against humans or be it against non-human animals?
Exactly. And that's definitely a continuation of first state building, and secondly, techniques of colonizing the, so to say, indigenous territories. So how can we measure them? How can we create a second layer of abstraction so that we can control them and monitor them in a better way? I'm talking about James Scott saying, like I said, on all the literature that expanded on that, on colonization, on measurement of improving, the will for improvement, and all that stuff coming on top of each other, layer for layer, and definitely so. And it is not just colonization or colonization plus state building, I would say, because it also happens in national context even today. In Turkey, for example, the same type of techniques of administration, it plays a role. And it starts with seeing the gap or seeing the kind of inefficiency in others, seeing something wrong with the other. So that is, I guess, the first step. These animals are not efficient enough, so replace them. And then unit by unit, the experts coming, a different discursive regime just starts to emerge. And step by step, we see all these techniques, institutions, administrations, rules, subsidies, financial institutions come into the picture and change the setup. And it is a very kind of well-studied colonial endeavor, I would say, to change the local, to change the indigenous in a way. Yes.
Yeah, plus I guess this so-called push for greater efficiency leading to self-sufficiency, so that states don't need to import so much anymore, and they are creating, in fact, producing more than what they need for their own consumption, so that they can even export to other countries and, you know, build up a thing of foreign reserves and stuff. It's also like an old idea, but I find it interesting how this increased production actually then leads to a push for creating an increased demand. And you've dealt with that in your article also, how this sort of industrial mass scale production of meat in a country like Turkey, which originally had a much lower per capita meat consumption figure as compared to other countries in the EU, meant that you had campaigns to popularize the consumption of meat, to urge people to eat more meat because there was more being produced. And then what do you do with it? And I find it interesting because it's sort of like going round in circles. First, you say we need greater efficiency because we need to create more. And then once you have created more, you say, now we need a greater demand because we've got all this, right? And we find again a parallel in India, not so much with meat perhaps, but there is also an advertising campaign for consuming eggs in India. And the same sort of reasoning to say that they're good for your health, and so everybody must consume eggs because there's been a revolution in the way poultry farms are run. There are more eggs being produced. The government has pumped money into producing more eggs, and now they need people to buy them. So it just goes round and round in circles.
Exactly. I can't really add anything to that, but definitely in my lifetime, I saw that with my own eyes. Like when I was young, and that was 25 years ago, there was no salad with meat. There was no such thing. I mean, salad was salad with greens and vegetables and all that stuff. Now, if I go to a restaurant, half of the menu of salad menu is made of meat, some sort of meat, chicken, cattle, something. I mean, why would you do that? And in breakfast here, I mean, in my circle at least, no one would eat really meat. Then in 1990s, we had salamis and, sausages and all that stuff, industrial processed foods and etc. Now, breakfast, lunch, dinner, regardless, Turkish community started eating meat. That's one of the aspirations, by the way, with all these policies, because meat is healthy, so to say. So let's eat more meat. And because we want to modernize the country, we want to catch up with the Western Europeans. And one way of doing that is to eat meat as they do. And it's such a bizarre logic, really. I can't really follow that, but exactly, that's happening. And one more thing, and when it comes to efficiency, it is also very strange, really, having this catch-up game. in a way, I mean, I don't want to really talk about in those terms, whether it is efficient or not efficient, etc. Because once you start playing that game, it is a different game. It becomes a different game. But again, Turkey is this kind of very dry country. It is not really very, depending on the region, but large tracts of Turkey is dry. And it means the grass is short, relatively short. And if you know, I don't know if you know the anatomy of the cattle, they have a long tongue. So they have to grasp the, grasp and pull it off. So that requires you have to have long grasp, which is not suitable to Turkey. Turkey is good for goat, good for lamb, good for other types of animals, but not for cattle. But the state somehow, in order to play the catch-up game, or let's become Holland, let's become Germany, etc. I don't know. Just put the wrong type of animals and gives that to wrong type of entrepreneurs. And it doesn't even work in terms of efficiency. But I mean, we can't even talk about that because it is not about, even efficiency, I see. It is a very, let me say this, it is, I know it is stupid to say, but it's a very stupid catch-up game that we are pursuing right now in Turkey.
I really agree with you there. My example, which I'm going to speak about now, is not from Turkey, but in the beginning of the 2000s, I happened to be working in an Indian restaurant, more specifically a Pakistani Indian restaurant in Paris. And I just saw how inefficient actually the whole thing is, because the restaurant would order massive quantities of chicken for each week, but they only used the chicken legs. And they threw away in the garbage the rest of it. And a chicken has obviously much more than its legs. So it was really mountains of meat that were being dumped in the garbage each week. And I just thought, well, that does not seem like a very efficient use of meat to me. I don't know. I mean, also for me, looking at it from an Indian perspective, this whole wastage of food, of something that could have helped someone else survive, was almost a criminal act. But it's also that there's a lot being produced, but not all of it is consumed, because a lot of it is considered not elegant enough, or not gastronomic enough, or not, 5-star enough or something. And I guess it plays out globally also. So it's not like an animal is slaughtered and all of it is eaten. There's a lot that's just discarded.
Yeah. And what are our priorities, just to add to that? Like, we don't even use the whole animal, even if in that violence, and the animals suffer as well. I mean, have you ever visited the chicken farms? So these huge, complex industrial sites. Unfortunately, I had to during my research. It's like some of them are small scale, and by small scale, I mean 20,000 animals are living in under one roof, and the big ones contain 100,000 chickens. Like it is a huge complex, and it is so difficult to enter those places. Because there are dead animals. I'm talking about meat chicken, by the way. There are two types, like egg chicken and meat chicken. There are dead animals. Someone has to go in, pick those dead animals, and they spraying antibiotics all the time. They don't even wait for the animals to become sick, because you can't really control 100,000 animals one by one. So they spray antibiotics all the time. There are dead animals. Someone picks them up, and etc. It is a huge, incredibly painful process. So one, that we don't even use the whole part of animals, and secondly, what are our priorities? What type of pain do you want to inflict on which type of living bodies, and all that stuff? After seeing that, you can't really stomach, I would say, chicken. I couldn't. I am a vegetarian for a very long time, but again, I can't do that. And I'm not romanticizing, or how to say, I'm not romantic, as I said several times, but this type of production is wrong to its bones. I mean, there are other ways of doing, if we are going to kill animals in one way or another, there are so many different ways of doing that.
I had one last question from my side, which is really driven by curiosity. I wanted to know what eventually happened to the animals, to the cattle and the livestock that the migrants had taken with them to cities. You showed us a picture of this cow eating from a dustbin in the city. from what I understood, they were not integrated into the agro-industrial zone, right? Because those were for, not for these people and not for their animals. So what happened to these animals?
Yeah, they diminished in numbers. There are still some cattle and sheep you can see in those cities, but they are now not as many as early 2000s, right after those displacements. Many of them were sold. Many of them, these people integrated into the urban life, so to say. So now they are buying their meat from butchers, from ordinary markets, and etc. So that was a kind of temporary period that happened, that lasted for about 10 years and so, and you can't really survive with your animals in the town center unless you have huge financial capital to change, to kind of create the infrastructure for yourself. So they sold them to slaughterhouses, probably.
Krishnandi, go ahead.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. So I just want to thank you for a great enlightening talk. I just wanted to ask about the social status and the position in the social hierarchy of the people who are employed in the abattoirs and in the slaughterhouses, who actually have to do the business of killing and butchering the animals. Because, for example, in India, the business of slaughter, the act of slaughter, is a job that has been consigned to Muslims and uh, people who are at the lowest rung of the Hindu religion, called Dalits, and they bear the mark of pollution in the larger society. So it becomes a tool of oppression, especially uh, given the ban on beef or the prohibition of beef and the quick transition of India into a Hindu country. So I was curious uh, as to what is the social of and
The last bit I cannot hear right now. Do you?
No, we lost him for a second there.
But I guess I get the gist of his question. Or should we wait?
I think he's frozen right now.
Yeah, I guess you can go ahead, Ozan, and if can come back, you can perhaps add to the question or clarify for us.
I know about the historical dimension that is happening in India, that the Dalit, you don't touch the meat. If you touch the meat, then you are untouchable yourself and all that stuff. In Turkey, the dynamics are different, but there is a similarity, obviously. And as you can guess, that those people working in slaughterhouses are the lowest class people. And now they are being replaced also by immigrant labor, like coming from Syria, Afghanistan, and all these countries. So there is a hierarchy in doing these type of jobs. So the job market in that regard is very much tied to the hierarchies that of that society, that who can get the privileged job, who will just have to do the, so to say, dirty jobs in that regard. If it's not religion, then it is class. It's not class, then it is gender. Somehow all these hierarchies replicate themselves in jobs, in jobs that we do. That's also another challenge, I would say, that how can we really think of a different, less hierarchical society in our treatment to animals, even in killing them? How can we then become more fair, not just to animals, but also to human beings that does that work? And in my mind, one of the answers is that that's also one reason that I go against the industrial meat production. Because it is one very kind of dynamic structure that recreates these hierarchies all the time, the class positions in Turkey. But I don't know about how you can respond to the religious aspect of it in India. It is ancient, not ancient, but it is older than the industrial meat production, as far as I know.
To go back to something you were talking about earlier about the autonomous ways and the autonomy that is available to local indigenous ways of being. And in your essay, you talk about control and how controlling animal populations has become a way to controlling human populations as well. So would you say then that there's more autonomy available to animals as such and less control, and that is why they're perceived as inefficient by the state?
Yeah, it is about control. But when I say control, when I talk about control, I'm talking about a technique, really, the technologies of governance. And in that regard, it is transferred easily from human domain to animal domain and back to human domain. It is applied to different populations. And biopolitics in that regard is not just about human beings in this case, but it very much regards to plants, to animals, to different types of species. And it is sometimes not one species, it is a collection of different species, collectives, I would call them, not social, not society, not just consisting of human beings, but of collectives. How can we talk about collectives? And to your question, back to your question, sorry, can you repeat the last bit? I just lost my train of thought.
Yeah.
Sorry,
I was just wondering about the connection between control and autonomy, and if it is because animals appear to have more autonomy that they're perceived as inefficient, the local way of being.
Exactly. Sorry, just like there was a moment of lapse on my side. And control in that regard, as you said, is not just about controlling animals. It is about controlling the kind of setting, really. All the actors that involved in that setting. It includes the villagers, it includes, when it comes to the animals, it includes the feed, it includes the plants that they are going to eat. So it includes the kind of the geometry of that space. How can we control and use it in a more, for the state, in a more efficient way? So that's the question. So I'm looking at this kind of transferences between different species and between different setups, how techniques are used in all these types of, so animal in that regard, controlling animals is not a unique question, but it is part of a larger question, the technologies of governance.
And connected to the autonomy part, and you also talk about ecological networks, and I was thinking, if it is, you also refer to Foucault, so it's also an essay informed by biopolitics. So I was also thinking, if it is possible to think about the animal as an agent at all, if that's, or if we always have to think about the animal in relation to the state or in relation to the indigenous farmers. But I fear that if we're always placing the cattle in relation to these different human actors, then they may fare better in one position, but the relationship is as such that they will always be, well, one position may be worse than the other. So is the nature of society such that it is not possible? Is it too radical to think of cattle as an independent entity?
Well, I spent a lot of time to think about agency in my book. I wrote a book in Turkish and translated into Turkish, and the introduction is all about how can we really redefine agency. And by agency, we usually think of this intention and the orientation, that we have an intention and we realize that then we become agent and all that stuff. I try to undermine that. I try to, using a Latourian, Bruno Latour conceptualization, I try to think about agents in a different way. If that node in the power structure changes the kind of effect, the impact, if it just not merely transfers the power coming from this side to the other side, but changes its content-wise in a different way, then there is a type of agency, an actant we see there. In that regard, I see different nodes, a composition of collectives that are changing the kind of story, the impacts, the influences, digesting them and putting out a different type of outcome. As long as we define agency as such, then we don't really have to talk about the intentions of animals, to what extent they imagine a world and etc. And not in all cases humans are perceiving the world with intentions and etc. Many things that we do happen without or outside of our intentions as well. So we are just influenced and we just somehow transform that influence and put out something else. As long as we do that, we are somehow actants. So if that's true, if that premise is acceptable, then we see a lot more actant acts, so to say, in other beings as well. Animals do change the story. Cattle do change the story, the species, the plants do change, microbes, viruses do change the story. So they are not just, mediators. Again, referring to Latourian conceptualization, mediator, just transferring one influence to the other side without changing it. That is mediation. Actant, on the other hand, changes that influence. So I change the kind of definition, expand the definition of actancy, and I see in all these stories that humans do not have a privileged position. We have more power to influence things, but we are not the only ones that change the stories. And the COVID story in the last 2 years just proved that over and over again, I guess. Anyway. Not 2 years, right? 3 years. Anyway, lost the chronology, lost the kind of temporal. Anyway,
I just had. I just wondered if you could talk a bit about what you mean by collective as opposed to social.
Usually it is, I mean, we can use also social as long as we define it in a different way. By social, I'm coming from a sociology background. That means we tend to take social as the collection of human beings, that how human societies created cultures and acted on things and acted on objects and etc. That is the social environment that we have. As opposed to that, I try to think with other agents, non-human agents in our collectives that are interacting with human beings, but not exclusively. They are also interacting with each other. They also have their own orientations and trajectories. They change the story. The bacteria before human beings changed the atmosphere entirely so that we can breathe now. So that story is not necessarily a social story in the old sociological conception, right? The changing the atmosphere over the billions of years, or the forest changing the soil structure, the composition of the soil over centuries, over millennia. So I try to engage with all these transformations as well. They also change the face of the earth, and I call these entanglements collectives, including humans and non-human beings together, as opposed to social that consists of only human beings.
Thanks, that's really helpful. And I just had one last question, which is if there's any room for animal rights activism in such situations.
Yes. Yes, I mean, it is a different type of question. It comes from a more judicial standpoint. How can we, I mean, it requires a different type of engagement with the states, with the laws, with the politicians. These are the rights codified here, and I said, you can't do this, you can't do that, and etc. This is a different type of engagement. But on a more philosophical level, I would say, how could we decrease the power inequalities between different beings? I don't say that we are equals. That's a contentious thing to say. I'm very, the more I think about that, the more I just not appreciate, but see inequalities, asymmetrical relations. And we really need to focus on these asymmetrical relations, even in human societies. I wrap it up, there will be a conclusion, don't worry. And by human societies, I don't mean in front of the law, we are equal. That's a different thing. But with my child, I have an asymmetrical relation, and I have to appreciate it. I have to see that, because I can't treat my son as my equal in his lifetime right now, 7 years old. I decide where he goes, I decide where he lives, and etc. So all these asymmetrical relations should be managed in a different way, could be managed in a different way, not as I am the oppressor, she is the, or the animal will be the victim, and etc. But how can we navigate through all these asymmetrical relations? And equality, creating inequality is one solution only. It's just one way of executing things or engaging with other beings, creating equality. It works for in some cases. But how can we really think about the equality of a human being and a worm? What would that mean? So your question, again, back to your question, animal rights, I see that. But what is the outreach of it? Which animals will be included through that? The insects, the bugs, the sea, the animals that we don't even see, what we just test nuclear bombs on them, right? So what type of activism and what type of rights are we talking about? It is so difficult. So I don't really have a straightforward answer to that there should be animal right activism, etc. But what type of animals are we thinking of, and how can we diminish the power inequalities between different species? That would be my starting point. And one way of doing that is to get rid of the very profit-oriented production regime that we have as of now. Does that make sense? I don't know, but it is a very long, convoluted answer, perhaps. I don't have a straight answer, sorry.
No, that's a really interesting position and very Latourian, I must say.
I guess so, yeah.
But thanks so much for spending 1 hour with us. Thanks for agreeing to talk to us during your holiday. It was such a great pleasure to have this conversation, and it's been so insightful.
Thanks for inviting me. I know I'm not working on the South Asian region, and despite so you invited me, I appreciate that very much, by the way. I hope to see you at some point in person and to have a coffee.
Thank you.
Zoom
Bye.
meetings are lacking that. Thank you.